In this lecture, we will be looking at the genre of painting. What's interesting about painting is in today's day and age, we always think of painting as a higher art. Yet for many years, it really wasn't considered to be one of the high arts. It was more looked at as something that was technical and not so much as artistic. Around the 15th century and in Italy, we began to see images of a figure called La Pittura, which literally means the picture. And this figure, as you can see here, began to appear in art. And what happens at this point is painting begins to gain respect as not just copying nature, but as an art form within itself. Again, before this time, it was mainly seen as a mechanical skill and not an artistic one. And you can see here the image. This is actually from a fresco from Vasari, and this is called The Art of Painting, and it was created in 1542, and it is a fresco in the vault of the main room in the Casa Vasari in Arzano, Italy. How we classify different painting styles is the same as how we did when we looked at drawing. It's actually classified by the different medium that is being used. And like paint and like drawing, here we have a pigment, the pigment or the color that is suspended in some sort of medium or binder. Remember, the binder is what holds the pigment together. And the binder in painting often also serves as a protector of the pigment and serves as an adhesive to fix the pigment onto the support. Now, the support is whatever the surface is that the artist is attempting to paint on. Now, often these supports are much too absorbent and they require some sort of prime or primer to them, and this is often called a ground. The ground usually makes the support surface much smoother and have a more uniform texture. And then solvents or vehicle are also used in a lot of the painting forms. And what these are thinners that actually enable the paint to flow more freely, and in some points it can actually completely dissolve the paints, and that's when they're used to clean the brushes or the tools. All right, well then the first type of painting, the first medium that we're going to look at is what's called encaustic. Encaustic is what happens when you combine pigment with a binder of hot wax. Now, this is one of the oldest painting medias that has been used, and it was used very widely in classical Greece. However, with this, it requires the painter to work very quickly so that the wax will stay liquid. We all know once the wax cools, it hardens. And this is a more current example of the encaustic method. This is entitled Flags, and it was created by Jasper Johns in 1954-55. And this is encaustic oil and corkage on fabric mounted on plywood. And if you look closer at the detail within the flag, you can see that texture. If you were actually to run your hand over this, you would feel that dried wax. The next medium we're going to look at is what's called fresco. And fresco is a form of wall painting, and this was practiced by the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And an example is one right here. This is actually a fresco from Pompeii in Italy. Pompeii was made very famous because when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, the ash went and fell and basically destroyed the town. Well, it killed everybody, but it also greatly preserved the town. And so we actually almost have these spaces where they have the people who kind of died where they were. But this gives an example of a fresco, and you can see this is a current image of one, so you can see how durable this has held up. Now, what happens in fresco is the pigment is mixed with lime water and then applied to a lime plaster wall. Now, you can apply this when the plaster is still wet, and this is called buon fresco, B-U-O-N. And this is where literally once it dries, the painting becomes part of the wall because the plaster is still wet. When working in this, the artist must work very quickly. Again, you've got to get the image in there before the plaster dries. This is a preferable method of fresco because it is extremely durable. The image that you see here, this obviously was a fresco that was the buon fresco, which was made when it was wet. Another example of that is going to be seen here. This is the Arena Chapel or the Scrivini Chapel. This was painted by Giotto circa 1305. And what you're looking at, this is an entire room that was created from frescoes. There are 38 different panels which tell the life of Mary and the life of Jesus. But what's interesting enough, as you look at that, it's not just the panels that are created as frescoes. The ceiling and then all the different architectural features, those are actually all painted by Giotto also. Again, this makes the work extremely durable. Now, the other type of fresco is the fresco secco, S-E-C-C-O. And what happens in the fresco secco is that the plaster is already dried, and then the paint, the pigment, is combined with binders, usually egg yolk, oil, or wax, and then it's applied to the dried surface of the wall. A disadvantage of this is moisture can creep in between the plaster and the paint, causing the paint to flake off the wall, because unlike the other fresco, this literally is painted on the surface. It does not become the surface. And what happens with this in wetter environments, this is not durable at all. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper in Milan was an example of this type of fresco, and it was actually almost completely lost. It wasn't until 1979 that efforts were made to restore it. If this hadn't occurred, this great work would be gone. So this dry fresco method only works in extremely dry areas. Fresco was very popular, as we already said, in the Egyptians, the Greeks, and Romans, but the early Renaissance painters through the Baroque painters, the 14th to 17th century, fresco had a resurgence. And the earlier works I've shown you, the Giotto work, in the Arena Chapel or the Scrivini Chapel, is an example of this fresco. And here you can see a closer image. This is one of the panels from the Arena Chapel, and this is the Lamentation. So here we have where Christ has been removed from the cross, and you can see everyone in mourning, and in fact even the angels in the sky are in mourning. Now, as artists continued to develop and play with frescoes, they became more technical and much more illusionistic. And you can see that in this work here. This is Fra Andrea Pozzo's The Glorification of St. Ignatius, 1691 to 94. And this is actually a ceiling fresco, meaning it was literally painted on the ceiling. And this is in the nave of St. Ignazio in Rome. And what he is doing in this painting is he's actually showing St. Ignatius ascending into heaven. And how he shows this is when you look up at it, all those structural features, that is painting. This is all painted on the ceiling, much like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, where it looks like there are architectural elements when in fact these are also painted. And what we see here is the sky seems to open up and just continue onward. So as the viewer, it almost seems as this is a limitless space, when in fact it is. It's painted on the ceiling itself. The next form that we're going to look at is what's called tempera. This is what happens when you combine water, pigment, and some gummy material, usually egg yolk. Tempera is applied with a fine pointed brush, and one of the disadvantages is that colors could not be easily combined. So anytime we try to do shading, you actually have to do it with hatching, those thin parallel lines. Tempera also dries very quickly, and it leaves virtually no brush strokes behind. Usually the tempera had to be applied to a surface like wood, and therefore it had to be prepared with a very smooth ground. What's called gesso is one of the most popular. This was the ground that was most often used, and it was made from plaster of Paris or chalk. And this also was very absorbent and extremely flexible. And here you can see an example of this. This is another work of Giotto's, and this is the Madonna and Child enthroned, circa 1310, and it's a tempera on panel. Now, An interesting thing with tempera, this can also be applied in layers because it can be very, very thin. And we're going to see that in this work. This is Sandro Botticelli's La Primavera, circa 1482. And this is tempera on gesso and ground on poplar panel. And what happens in this one, when they went back to restore it and examined it, they take x-rays of these paintings now. And what they found in this one is that in some areas there are actually up to 30 different layers of the tempera on here to add to the layers of the work. And it gives, especially in the clothing where they seem light and flowing and translucent, he was able to create that by layering and layering and layer the layers of the paint. All right, next we have probably one of the most important moments in painting, and this was the invention of oil paints. They were created by the Flemish in the 15th century. And what happens with oil paints is they are much more versatile and they can be blended on the painting surface. We also see more colors, deeper colors, and richer colors. And because oil paints are so slow to dry, artists can again blend the colors right there on canvas, and they can make changes, and then they can spend time creating the detail and shading that they want. So with oil paints, we're able to see more realistic and three-dimensional effects. Oil paint can also be thinned with turpentine to the point where it is almost transparent, or it can be used straight from the tube and molded into three-dimensional shapes and applied to a support with a palette knife, and this is what's called impasto. In oil paints, the binder is a linseed oil, which makes it very, very slow to dry. And again, this allows the artist to make changes. And so we can see in this work here, this is a triptych. This is by Robert Campin, and this is the Annunciation, circa 1425 to 30, and it's an oil on wood. And so within here, you can see very realistic images. We can see very crisp, clear details from the left-hand side where we have the patrons, meaning the people who paid for the work on the left. And then the centerpiece, where this is the moment where the angel comes and tells Mary that she is going to be pregnant with God's child. And what's very interesting, if you look on the left-hand side of the centerpiece, under the second window, if you look, there's a little tiny baby Jesus flying in holding a cross. And if you follow the implied line, it's going to go right to that point on Mary's lap where it's brighter. And so all of these very fine, intricate details are something that could be created because of the oil paints. And this became very popular with the Dutch still life painters. Dutch still life painters, these were vanitas paintings where it looks like we're just painting a still life. We're painting what is there. But most of the time, these Dutch still lifes were filled with moralistic messages. And you can read about the moralistic message behind Still Life with Lobster by Jean de Heim in your textbook. But this was made in the late 1640s, and this is also an oil on canvas. Again, you can see these very bright, rich colors and the detailing that is able to be achieved because of the oil paints. Next, we have what's called watercolor. Watercolor, many of us are familiar with and probably have used sometime in our life. What happens in watercolor is you are applying pigment that is suspended in a solution of water and gum arabic to a dampened paper. Now, depending on the absorbency of the paper and the amount of watercolor on the brush, the watercolor can spread along the fibers of the paper. You can make watercolor so it's very, very transparent. On its nature, it's typically transparent. But if you use very little water and a lot of the pigment itself, watercolor can take on the look of other paints. To the point where you can see in the work here, if you look at the leaves and the flowers, they don't even seem transparent. So with this, you've got very little water and much more pigment. Usually, again, though, watercolors are transparent, meaning you're able to see through them. They usually dry quickly. Now, the paper might not dry very quickly, but the pigment goes into the paper and remains there. Also, that means watercolors cannot be reworked. Once the pigment is on the dampened paper, it is there to stay. And watercolors, a lot of artists prefer them because they have this sense of fluidity within the works. All right, next we are going to look at what's called gouache or gouache. And what this is similar to watercolor, but what happens is it mixes watercolor with Chinese white chalk. And it creates a work that is not transparent but is opaque, meaning that it cannot be seen through. However, this is very difficult to blend, and you cannot blend it, the brush strokes together, and you really have a hard time blending it with other colors. Because of this, you tend to see very large, flat, colored forms. And you can see that in the work here. This is Jacob Lawrence's. You can buy bootleg whiskey for 25 cents a quart from 1942-43. And this is the gouache on paper. So in some areas you get still that sense of flow from watercolor, but not quite that delicacy, and it's a material that's even harder to work with. Next, we're going to go on to what's called synthetic paints, or more commonly known as acrylics. What these are man-made materials. And with the invention of acrylic paints, we have such a variety of colors. We control gloss, we control if they're waterproof or not. And so what happens with these is the pigment is chemically treated. The most popular example is probably what's called the magna. These are made from acrylic resins. Acrylic resins are what are used to make plastics, and then they're mixed with turpentine. In here you can see Jeremy Deller's A Good Day for Cyclists, and this is acrylic on wall 2013. Once acrylic paints dry, they are extremely durable, and when they are dried, they're pretty much immune to the forces of nature. They can be, again, treated to change the gloss, meaning the reflection of them. So when you go into Home Depot, when you go into Lowe's, and you're looking at house paints, these are going to be acrylic paints. And you can tell, like if you have paints to paint your bathroom, that's going to be different than a paint to paint your living room. The one to paint your bathroom is definitely going to be much more water resistant because it's going to be in a wet environment. Same thing, usually paints for kitchens. They're going to recommend something with a higher gloss. Why? Kitchens, you have oils and grease in the air, and you want to be able to wash the surface. If you did that to a traditional oil painting or other paints, you would destroy the paint. But because of the advances in the technology with acrylic paints, we can create those. And then something that is very popular in acrylic paints is acrylic paints. First in 1949, they were put into an aerosol spray can. And from that, we get spray paint. So with that, we have the advent of graffiti art. And this is an example of this. This is Kenny Schroff's, this is the mural on Houston Street in Soho, Manhattan, New York. And this is how it appeared in 2011. I can't verify it still looks this way. But this was created using the spray paint. Spray paint is a favorite of graffiti artists because it is very hard to remove. Alright, well, just like when we talked about drawing mediums, painting mediums can also be combined, and it can be combined in different ways. One example, and usually we call these mixed media, which is a combination of different materials. One of the most popular is what's called collage. Collage is the process of pasting or gluing fragments or printed matter, fabric, natural material, basically anything that's relatively flat, onto the two-dimensional surface of a canvas or a panel. And you can see that here in Juan Gris's The Table. This is created in 1914, and it is a collage of colored papers, printed matter, charcoal and paper mounted on canvas. So this is that mixed media. Mixed media is just what it sounds like. The artist takes different medias and they mix them together. We also have what's called a photo montage, and what this is when a collage consists entirely of photographs. And this is also popular in film. When you're watching a segment of a film and it's just image after image after image after image, that is a photo montage. And then finally we have what's called combine painting or high relief collage. These became popular in the modern era. Why? Because we have to remember in the modernist era, the idea was to make it new. And your artists were challenging the idea of what a traditional painting was or meant. And what happens in these combine paintings is they are a combination of painting in different forms. The artist would bring together objects of diverse and various kinds and then simply allow them to coexist besides one another in the same space. And we see this in Robert Rauschenberg's monogram. This is 1955 to 59. And what happens is he actually takes the canvas and he lays it on the floor. And so everything else is applied to the canvas, but the canvas is literally off the wall. In fact, I believe how it currently is now, it's actually on wheels. So this is made of oil, fabric, wood. It's on canvas and wood. There's rubber heel, tennis ball, a metal plaque, hardware, a stuffed Angora goat, a rubber tire, and this is all mounted on 4 wheels. And again, this is an example of that combine painting or high relief collage. It still has some of the traditional elements of a painting in it, yet it almost becomes sculptural-like. And that's done on purpose because remember, the artists are trying to challenge the idea of what a painting is. That concludes the lecture on painting. Your textbook goes into much more detail, but again, this lecture is meant to supplement that reading.